Hey guys, welcome back to another video of
Okay, King.
this is the series in which you will see what will happen if Nar as select Dratini as his first Pokemon. So they had already on the road and now they are going to the Viridian Forest, but before that Leap is going to join this journey. Obviously that Leap who has the power of Viridian and the power to heal Pokemons and talk to them. So if you're new on the channel, subscribe, turn on the bell icon, and without any more delay, check out the playlist section, especially because you will see many kind of different fans related to Pokemon. So let's begin.
Ash took a bite of the sandwich his mom packed for him as he slumped against a tall dark brown oak tree. He glanced around, the long dirt road his only companion in sight for miles inside. He'd done that a lot today. After beginning his journey with more excitement than he could handle, he began to grow tired. Sleep allured him like a siren. The occasional Spearow, Pidgey or Rattata aside, he'd hardly encountered any noteworthy Pokémon that interested him. He'd walked for no more than a few hours and taken a break once his body began to tire under the scorching summer heat. He gazed at the only Pokeball clipped on his Pokeball belt intently. He hadn't let Dratini out yet. Its fearsome display in Professor Oak's lab had Ash wary before letting out the fierce dragon. If Dratini didn't hold back in the presence of a dragon master such as Lance, he barely stood a chance of controlling it. However, he'd made up his mind to get to know his starter. He wanted to do it right now. He brushed off all the hesitation that clouded him and raised the Pokeball. In a flash of bright scarlet energy, his Dratini materialized in front of him. Its intense glare made Ash flinch. Taming this one wasn't going to be easy. Dratini took a quick look around its surroundings, its fiery gaze scanning almost every inch of the land and the trees around them, and once it had made sure that nothing around was of interest, it curled its long frame, resting its head on top. Its form seemed relaxed. It hadn't given Ash a moment of its attention apart from an initial glance that hardly lasted a second. Well, at least it was calmer than last time. Ash didn't dare disturb the dragon. Not right now anyway. However, this was a great chance for him to get information about his Dratini. He quickly removed his Pokédex from his pocket and scanned Dratini. The Pokédex instantly began to speak. Dratini, the dragon Pokémon. Dratini sheds its skin as it grows, often doing so while hidden behind large powerful waterfalls. This Dratini is male. Its ability is shed skin. Its moves are Dragon Breath, Wrap, Aqua Jet, Leer and Shock Wave. Dratini's moveset had Ash impressed. He couldn't resist a wild grin at the prospect of his starter already knowing moves such as Shock Wave and Aqua Jet. Dragon Breath aside, those two moves provided substantial type coverage which would allow Ash to form a multitude of strategies focused around them. In simpler battles, those moves would do more damage to Pokémon which Dragon-type moves weren't effective against. While Ash stared at his Dratini with feverish elation, its eyes snapped open and a cold glare pierced through Ash. Ash's grin plummeted into a wince at what was to come. "Don't!" Ash cried as draconic energy collected inside Dratini's mouth. "Damn it, not now!" he screamed, frantically shielding his face as his mind turned bereft of any ideas to resolve the predicament. Dragon Breath wasn't something Ash could simply take head-on. Its raw power had been enough to decimate that machine in Professor Oak's lab, and he feared for himself even more when the images of the scene blistered through his head. However, as he braced himself, the Dragon Breath simply passed by him, in not too dissimilar a way that it had in the lab. In fact, he'd barely felt the air current. Ash steadily opened his eyes and looked through the opening between his fingers. Dratini appeared to have calmed himself down, as he'd gone back to rest. He frowned, then turned around to find an injured Rattata quivering in pain. He grimaced at the sight, but the faintest thread of satisfaction brushed his heart. Dratini had simply tried to keep the rat away from him. But that feeling was fleeting, and he didn't waste a mere moment before he swiftly pulled out a potion from his backpack and sprayed it around the wounded Rattata. He winced at the cry from Rattata. He didn't enjoy Pokémon in pain even if they weren't his. He picked it up carefully and placed it gently against the tree, his features brightening when Rattata's eyes squinted open. He sighed in relief of not just the Rattata being okay, but also at the fact that Dratini hadn't already started to hate him. He'd feared that might have been the case when Dratini had launched his dragon breath. "You'll be as good as new in a while," he mumbled before he turned towards his starter. "Hey Dratini," he called softly, stepping closer to the dragon, careful enough to not startle the beast. "You shouldn't just attack any Pokémon like that." Doubt still lingered in his mind, but he fought past them and eventually brought himself to pet the little dragon on the head. And, to his pleasant surprise, Dratini didn't retort. His eyes opened, which made Ash uneasy for a moment, but his gaze wasn't as deadly as before. As Ash caressed the skin on his head more and more comfortably, Dratini shrieked the faintest of coos, apparently enjoying the feeling. However, as soon as Ash chuckled, Dratini shut his eyes viciously and his head whirled the other way. He shoved Ash's hand away with his tail and the lash hurt more than a little. Was the little mighty dragon just trying to act tough? Ash snickered at the thought. Maybe, getting to know Dratini wouldn't be as challenging as he'd imagined. The rest of the day had gone by without incident. He'd come across a few starting trainers but had restrained the urge to challenge them. As the sky turned a resplendent shade of orange, bringing with it many caws and hoots of Pokémon returning to their nests, a clash of distant shadows snatched Ash's attention. He jogged in its direction and in his view came an orange-haired girl standing against a young boy. Neither of them looked any older than him. He recognized the girl's victorious starfish-like Pokémon as a Staryu while the fainted Pokémon on the boy's side was a Mankey. Ash strode towards them and by the time he arrived, the boy had already left. "Hey there," he called, getting the girl's attention. "Wanna battle?" He hadn't come across anyone with a Staryu yet, so he looked forward to a battle with the water type. It might prove to be a decent opponent for Dratini's first bout. The orange-haired girl observed Ash for a moment before she raised her Pokeball. "Sure," she grinned, "but I warn you, I am strong. You'll just be heading to the Pokémon Center like that boy just now did." Ash rolled his eyes and smirked a moment later. "We'll see about that, won't we?" This girl didn't have any idea what she was up against. Ash's excitement surged as he raised his Pokeball in front of him and so did the girl. The Pokémon that came out of the girl's Pokeball was the one she'd used in her earlier match, a Staryu. In the flash of light, Dratini materialized on the ground. He shrieked at Staryu dangerously and looked away immediately, unimpressed. He screeched a few more times. It almost seemed as if he was warning the water type not to mess with him or the consequences would be deadly. That wasn't too difficult to conclude, not for Ash anyway. Ash raised an eyebrow snidely. "Still think you'd beat me that easily?" The girl's jaw dropped. "You have a Dratini," she exclaimed. She probably didn't expect a trainer on Route 1 to own a Dratini. So many experienced trainers searched for one but not many succeeded. "How did you get that?" "He's my starter," Ash stated confidently, his grin widening by the second. "Shall we begin?" She blinked a few more times before she shook herself out of her stupor. She nodded and gave an order. "Misty calls water gun." "What calls?" Ash frowned at the unusual order by the girl but soon rolled his eyes. "Shock wave." While Dratini laid on the ground without a care in the world, Staryu pointed its topmost limb at the serpent, and out of it, a stream of water rippled at Dratini. The dragon opened his eyes once he sensed the attack and slid to the left as the water gun slipped past him without posing a threat. "Damn," Ash cursed as he slapped his forehead. He'd been afraid of this. He had a bad feeling that Dratini might ignore his orders in a battle. "So, you can't control it, huh?" Misty sniggered cockily. She grinned as her left hand settled on her hips. "Now Psy-Wave. Dodge and use Shock Wave, Dratini," Ash said, more in hope than anything. Light blue wisps of energy weaved and outlined Staryu's body. The sheen soaked from its limbs down to its red core. Gentle pulses from the core almost allured Ash into feeling okay, but he bit his lip, bracing himself in the eye before the storm. The orb flashed brighter and fired pulsing rings of Arctic psychic energy towards Dratini. The Psy-Wave smashed into Dratini, who hadn't even tried to evade the move, taking it head-on instead. Blemishes flourished across his blue skin, but he didn't flinch. His blare viciously burned with rage as it fixed on Staryu. Ash grimaced and pursed his lips. Ignoring his orders was one thing, but Ash's dismay was more because Dratini was hit and injured. Dratini could make quick work of Misty's Staryu if he wanted to. It was distinctly evident from its water gun, which lacked both power and accuracy, that Staryu wasn't a threat to him. But if Dratini refused to attack, the damage would eventually lead to his defeat. Just as Ash was about to recall his Pokémon, blue sparks of electricity cackled around the bump on Dratini's head. A moment later, a wave of concentrated electricity bolted at Staryu, cackling around the water type as it pitifully shivered and cried anguishingly. Its orb dimmed to a low flicker for a few moments before it stopped and Staryu slumped on the ground. But Dratini wasn't done. His foe had all but fallen, yet he charged another shock wave and sent Staryu crashing back into the stream of water nearby, its silenced cries banging deep into Ash's eardrums. The second attack had been even deadlier than the first. "Staryu," Misty cried, rushing into the river and taking her fainted Pokémon in her arms. Ash scowled at the many burns and bruises on the Staryu, his arms extending but his lips failing him as he tried to mouth words of apology. He could only watch as the distraught girl tapped Staryu with its Pokeball and glared daggers at Ash, her eyes bloodshot. "You should be ashamed. Going around with a Pokémon you can't even control. You're a pathetic excuse for a trainer." Ash didn't find the words to respond to her claims. He wanted to apologize, but he didn't like being insulted. As his thoughts drifted, searching for words to speak, Misty whistled off on her bicycle before he had the time to speak. Ash blinked. His teeth sunk callously deep into his lips, drawing a drop of blood that he absent-mindedly licked. She wasn't wrong. He couldn't go around with a Pokémon he didn't have control of. That was his failure as a trainer. He recalled Dratini into his Pokeball and gazed at it. He had a long way to go before he could become a Pokémon master. Night had come and went, and Ash had a lot on his mind. His mood hadn't been the brightest since the battle with Misty. He'd thought that Dratini was a troublemaker but would obey him in battles, but he now understood how naive he'd been. It wouldn't be that easy to conquer a Pokémon even Lance called difficult to handle. That night, he'd eaten the last of the homemade food that his mom had packed for him, and fed Dratini the Pokémon food he'd brought. He had to admit that Dratini's eating habits weren't one he'd associate with a headstrong Pokémon like him. His attempts at talking to Dratini that night had been in vain. The dragon showed interest in him at times but would rebel when Ash tried to get more comfortable. Although, in that time, Ash had noticed that Dratini seemed interested the moment he brought up anything regarding Pokémon battles. A new dawn refreshed Ash's spirits. Ash had already eaten his breakfast in a small cafe on the way, and he'd let out Dratini again. He poured some Pokémon food in his bowl and placed the bowl in front of Dratini. "There you go," he smiled warmly. "Eat up, Dratini." Even though the events of last evening frustrated him, Ash couldn't help but delight when he looked at Dratini. Dratini didn't need another invitation as he dug into his meal. He didn't devour the food, instead opting to eat nice and slow. But Ash could tell that he was enjoying it as he chewed on one chunk after another. He grunted when the bowl had emptied. Dratini was a fond eater. "You want more?" Ash asked in amusement. Upon receiving a slightly hesitant nod from the Pokémon, he chuckled and poured some more food into the bowl. Dratini finished off the last of the chunks with a satisfied squeal. Ash couldn't help but smile easily at that. A few hours later, Ash stood against a brown-haired trainer, and in front of him was his Dratini. The Pokémon he faced was a small brown avian Pokémon with red wings. Both Dratini and Spearow stared at each other aggressively, none of them breaking their gaze. "Spearow, Fury Attack!" the boy yelled. His Spearow obeyed as it flapped its wings and rushed towards Dratini, its crooked beak glowing in a silver hue. "Let it come to you, Dratini," Ash instructed, carefully eyeing Spearow. "Now, use Wrap." Ash's command came right before Spearow hit Dratini with its beak, but it could only do it once as Dratini had the flying type in his grasp, his long body wrapped firmly around it. Spearow struggled to get out but eventually cried as Dratini tightened his grip even further. Ash clenched his fists, overjoyed as his lips slipped into a mad grin. Finally, Dratini had done something he'd told him to. However, he realized that he could celebrate later. "Shock Wave," he ordered. "Break out of it." Its trainer cried in fear, eyes widened as he realized the danger of the electric attack. Blue jolts of electricity concentrated around Dratini and Spearow shrieked haplessly at the mercy of the shock. Its wings jostled against Dratini but to no avail, the dragon finally letting go of its foe once its struggle had ended. "Return, Spearow," the boy recalled his fallen flying type. He stepped forward and offered a handshake to Ash. "You've got an amazing Pokémon, dude." Accepting the handshake, Ash grinned. "That's true." As the boy left, he bent down and petted Dratini for a well-earned victory. Although Dratini wasn't amused as he instantly glanced away, slapping Ash's hand aside and slithering under the shadow of a nearby tree. Ash chuckled wryly. "I guess we'll have to take it slow." Ash fought a few trainers on the way, and he couldn't express the joy he'd felt when he won Pokémon battles with Dratini. To his pleasant surprise, Dratini had caused little ruckus since the battle with Misty. Dratini hadn't obeyed all of his orders, but Ash was happy enough with the ones he had. He reminded himself that that would change with time. So far, he was well on track. Viridian City was as large and overwhelming as he remembered. Tall skyscrapers sprawled across the landscape like mountains, burying the more old and cultural structures. Pudgy and greasy scents flooded his nostrils. He never felt further away from home. It wasn't oppressive, but he preferred air fresh. The city was a dream for many a country people. The facilities and opportunities it provided made it one of the biggest cities in the region of Kanto, but he couldn't care less for it. More than a week had passed since Ash had started his journey, and he'd had no major stops in between. He hadn't caught a single Pokémon in that time, but he didn't mind. He'd fought enough trainers on the way to make the time worthwhile. Numerous battles and victories later, he believed he'd had a substantial learning curve and gotten closer to Dratini, if only a little. He genuinely thought that he'd found it easier to communicate with Dratini after each passing day, after each battle. He'd begun to listen to Ash more and more, and although the odd uncalled attack and bouts of disobedience still occurred, it was getting better. Over the past few days, Ash had been pensive about a name for Dratini. He'd pondered over one for his Charmander before getting his starter, but it wasn't fated for him to get the fire type. Draco, Dracon, Drake. Those names sounded a bit too common. There was one name that he thought would suit Dratini's personality perfectly though. And it sounded cool. Kaiser. He'd ask if the name struck Dratini's fancy later, although he wasn't sure how the little proud dragon would take to being named. A sigh escaped Ash as the Pokémon Center came into view. The two-story building which operated as a hospital for Pokémon also acted as a lodge for traveling trainers. Provisions such as battling and training grounds for Pokémon were a welcome addition. It was a trainer's hub, and major cities like Viridian housed multiple of these in different parts of the city. On the way, Ash had come across the police station right after he'd entered the city. A quick identification check through his Pokédex was all it took for the local officer Jenny to allow him entry. The city bustled with vehicles honking, chattering people and Pokémon, but, thankfully, it was much quieter around the Pokémon Center. Ash entered the building to find several people, some trying to get their Pokémon healed while others got their Pokémon back from the nursing counters. The restaurant to his left housed more than a few people, as some chatted with other trainers, some with their Pokémon, and a few preferred to eat their meals alone in peace. Ash walked to one of the two counters in the Pokémon Center, each minded by a Nurse Joy and a Chansey. It was a culture around the world that most Pokémon centers followed. They were managed by at least one Nurse Joy, amongst other doctors and nurses. The most common feature amongst the female Joys was their beautiful hair, which always had some shade of pink. Ash reached the counter. "Good evening, Nurse Joy," he greeted politely. "Good evening," she chimed back merrily. "How may I help you?" Ash returned her smile. "Do you mind healing my Pokémon?" he asked, placing Dratini's Pokéball on the counter. Dratini probably needed little treatment since Ash had used potions on any minor injuries that he'd suffered in his battles, and there weren't a lot. But he still thought it better to get a quick check just in case. Quick checkups in Pokémon centers barely took a few minutes and were enough to heal Pokémon completely, unless the damage was more severe. Nurse Joy nodded and called for a pink ovoid Pokémon, a Chansey, who took Dratini's Pokéball, which Joy had placed in a tray, and merrily skipped to the treatment room behind them. Its jovial squeals brought a smile to Ash's face. Chansey enjoyed healing Pokémon from what he'd learned about them, and this one seemed to be no exception. A couple of minutes later, the same Chansey brought the Pokéball and handed it over to the pink-haired nurse, who thanked the Pokémon for the help. "Here you go," Joy said, heaping the Pokéball on the counter. "Your Pokémon's all healed up." "Thanks, Nurse Joy." Ash flashed a smile to the pretty woman as he accepted the Pokéball. The next afternoon, Ash found himself headed to the battling arena behind the Pokémon Center. He'd decided to take a day of rest in the city before he made off for Viridian Forest. The daunting nature of the forest that spawned the area between Viridian and Pewter was common knowledge. Some of the stories that did the rounds in the Pokémon Center startled him. Trainers getting lost inside for days, weeks or months, swarms of Beedrill and other venomous bugs victimizing ignorant starting trainers who dared to enter the perilous woodland and invade their dwellings, amongst other gossip, made him shudder to think what it would have in store for him. If Ash were to walk through the forest straight, it would take him close to 2 weeks to reach the end. And then, there was Route 2, which was a short road connecting the outskirts of Viridian Forest to Pewter City. The trip would be long enough, so he decided not to rush. Ash knew that there was a Pokémon gym in Viridian City itself. But he also knew that it required trainers to have at least 7 gym badges before being qualified to challenge it. Most gyms in the Kanto region didn't have the restriction of having a certain number of badges, but some did. And Viridian Gym was famed for its difficulty. Barely any challengers had won a gym badge from it in years. And even then, those badges were won because the gym leader was away and the gym was being cared for by gym trainers. Ash felt an odd excitement at the prospect of attempting such a difficult challenge when he was stronger. He would surely return. Cries of a Pokémon battle brought a spring in Ash's strides. He grinned as he reached the battlefield and saw a Charmander pitted against a small tadpole Pokémon, Poliwag. The battle was at its conclusion as the Poliwag had many wounds throughout its body. Charmander fared better with only a few minor injuries. A light blast of orange flames from the Charmander effectively ended the battle in its victory. However, at what met his gaze right after that, Ash frowned. The Charmander's trainer, purple-haired and dressed in a brown jacket, kicked the little lizard Pokémon disdainfully. Ash's eyes bulged at the sight, his fingers scrunched into cannons and his nostrils flared. He grimaced, unable to believe the brutality with which the trainer pumped his foot into Charmander's gut again. The poor Charmander didn't even try to retaliate. It cried at the pain, but its distraught gaze remained silently fixed on the floor. "You weakling," Charmander's trainer grunted loudly, his teeth gritting as he shot a dirty look at Charmander. "You took so long to win against that joke of a Pokémon." Charmander grimaced, shrieked and braced itself for another one of its trainer's vicious kicks. But Ash charged towards the loathsome trainer and slammed his hand into the boy's chest, driving him towards the wall. Driven by rage at the sight of violence against creatures he so dearly loved, Ash held the boy by the scruff of his neck against the wall. "What did you think you were doing?" Ash scowled, his voice coarse. "Pokémon were to be caught and befriended, not abused like this junkie was just doing. Fools like you don't deserve to be trainers. Don't you have any shame treating a Pokémon like that? That's my Pokémon. I can do what I want with it." Charmander's trainer snarled, knocking Ash's hands off of him, forcing Ash to let go of his collar. He straightened himself up, adjusting his shirt. "Who are you to teach me how I should use my Pokémon, anyway? You think you can get away with this?" Ash glared at him. He could feel the blood rising in his eyes, surging to his brain. "It's a crime to abuse Pokémon. Why don't we teach this kid a lesson, eh, Damien?" Came another amused voice from behind Ash. Ash turned around, but his scowl didn't lighten. He glared down at the new guy with the same disdain as he'd looked at Charmander's trainer, now identified as Damien. If Ash were to fight these guys with his sole Pokémon, he'd be at a disadvantage in numbers. But the challenge didn't bother him. The one-on-one battles had been far too easy for Dratini anyway. Ash narrowed his eyes and unclipped the only Pokeball on his belt. "Let's see who teaches who," he smirked. "HMPH, Damien snorted smugly. "He thinks he can beat us in a Pokémon battle." He grinned, his eyes glinting evilly. "Let's kick this kid's ass." The other trainer smirked as he removed a Pokeball from his pocket. Ash rolled his eyes at their ignorance. They had no idea what they were getting themselves into. When his Dratini materialized, Damien and his friend's jaws stooped, and Ash was sure that they'd have plummeted to the floor had it been physically possible. They gasped, then grit their teeth. Ash savored every moment of their frustration before calling out their Pokémon. Damien had chosen a purple bat-like Pokémon who bared its sharp fangs, while the other boy's Pokémon was a gray-colored humanoid with bulging muscles. Dratini, Ash got his starter's attention. "These guys treat their Pokémon like tools. Let's teach them a lesson." Dratini sent a confused glare Ash's way, but his confusion vanished when he laid eyes on the battered Charmander. He snarled at his foes, his eyes dangerously sparkling with almost as much rage as Ash. "Golbat, wing attack," Damien shouted with intensified rage. He probably wasn't too fond of someone else telling him to change his filthy ways. "Use Karate Chop, Machop," the other boy ordered. "Make use of your speed to dodge and then use Shock Wave on Golbat." Ash commanded, considering his opponent's Pokémon. His best bet was to get rid of one of the two Pokémon first, regardless of the fact that Dratini might have been strong enough to take them both on at once. Muscular power concentrated in Machop's fists as its muscles swelled and it dashed forward. On its side, Golbat's wings gained an almost transparent glow and both of them dangerously dashed at Dratini. The dragon, though, showed sublime agility to slide away from Machop, its fists meeting thin air as it growled back towards Dratini. "Golbat, However, proved faster than Ash and Dratini had imagined, as it swung its wings at the dragon. Dratini leapt up, evading the first of the swings, but a second one landed a hit and sent him crashing on the ground, sweeping backwards. Golbat hissed victoriously, but it didn't realize that it was only fueling Dratini's rage. "Ha ha," Damien laughed sinisterly. "That's what you get for being so full of yourself." He was thrilled to get an early strike. Wing attack again. Dratini had already begun charging bluish thunder on top of his head, and he let the electricity rip through the atmosphere, crackling and thundering its way towards Golbat. Golbat barely had a millisecond to process the words of its trainer before the shock wave had it screeching. Its jolted, quivering form floated in the air, then fell on the ground like a feather. Machop had swung its fists and missed Dratini again. It angrily growled at Dratini, who was all too happy to roar back even louder. "Use Karate Chop again, Machop," the other boy yelled. "Hit that snake this time." Ash took a moment to observe Golbat, and deduced it could no longer fight. If it tried to, it wouldn't pose a threat. "Let's use Dragon Breath." Machop's encore yielded similar results to its previous attempts, but its eyes widened in horror when Dratini spat flames of dragon energy. The fire cracked and hissed like a whip as it flew through the air, striking it in the gut. Burn marks charred into the Pokémon's body. "Now, Aqua Jet," Ash said, a ghost of a smile playing on his face. Dratini summoned a gush of pulsing water. The water weaved like a needle to a thread around his body as he roared and dashed at his foe with super speed. Ash's eyes failed to follow the move, and he only saw an anguishing Machop crash against the wall when Dratini's Aqua Jet made contact. "What?" Damien cried in disbelief, his jaw wide open. He gritted his teeth in exasperation before he noticed the glare that was aimed at him from the Pokémon that had just destroyed his Golbat. Damn, he recalled Golbat and his friend did the same to his Machop, then threw a Pokeball toward the wall from his pocket, which crashed and broke in two. He turned his frustrated stare at Charmander to his right, who'd been observing the battle with reticent curiosity. "I don't need you anymore, Charmander. You're useless," he yelled before he hastily rushed out through the door, followed by his friend. Ash's glare softened moments after the thugs had left, and he felt a triumphant smile creep in. It had been more than a simple victory in a Pokémon fight, it was one for a Pokémon. He stepped towards the Charmander, who appeared shocked as it gazed at Ash with glittering eyes. Dejection soon took over as its face fell into a saddened look, its tail languidly drooping on the floor as the flames on it dimmed ever so slightly, but enough for Ash to notice. Its injuries weren't severe, but Ash winced at the sight of sizzling blood creeping from the bruises laid on it by the kicks and stamps from its former trainer rather. Rage filled Ash's blood again. Such atrocity against Pokémon was unfathomable and unacceptable. Despite the growing temptation to find and beat Damien a million times harder than it had done to Charmander, Ash composed himself. Carefully, Ash squatted to Charmander's level and stroked its head, the fire type plodding its gaze to him. Ash smiled warmly at Charmander, whose face brightened as if it had seen a hero. He gently picked up Charmander. It struggled, trying to claw its way out, then lurching its tail, but a few strokes on its head calmed it down. Ash still smiled at Charmander warmly, and it finally gave in, coiling its body in Ash's embrace, its skin somewhat scorching for a moment, but the heat died down soon enough. "Don't worry, Charmander," he whispered as gently as he could. "Nothing like that will ever happen to you again." Charmander had gone through enough. A minute later, Ash had reached the healing counter. "Nurse Joy," he called out, "can you treat this Charmander, please?" Smiling with as much calm as she always did, Joy nodded. "Of course. Can you please recall it in its Pokeball?" she requested. Ash grimaced, eyes squinting when he felt Charmander almost tremble at the mention of a Pokeball. You see Nurse Joy, his gaze dipped at the Charmander as he reached to pet it. Its tail perked up slightly at the gesture. This Charmander is not mine. Its trainer left it after a battle. Nurse Joy caught Ash's drift and called for Chansey immediately, who carried Charmander inside in a wheeled stretcher. It seemed afraid as it was being taken away, its eyes pleading to Ash, but Ash's smile assured it that it'd be okay. What's the Charmander's story? Nurse Joy asks, leaning on the desk. That didn't look like a wild Charmander. It was being abused by its trainer, Ash began, fists clenching reflexively at the mere thought of Damien and his ways. He dearly wanted to squash the image of the Charmander's sufferings out of his mind. When I confronted him about it, and told him to not do that, we had a battle and then, he sighed, taking a deep breath. That guy threw Charmander's Pokeball, saying it wasn't needed anymore. How terrible, Joy mumbled. But these things happen from time to time. There are trainers who take out their own shortcomings on their Pokémon. Ash glanced at her and saw a dark shadow hover over her face. I see, logic failed him when he thought about the matter. He couldn't comprehend the reasons for trainers to act that way, but he couldn't deny that there must be others out there who did the same. He shuddered when he imagined and questioned if there were trainers even worse than Damien, Pokémon in even more pain than Charmander. Not a word was uttered by either Joy or Ash until Chansey brought Charmander out again. Its physical condition appeared great, but its mental state might not be the same. Its eyes bore sadness, making Ash's stomach sink. The poor Pokémon probably had no clue what to do next. Hey Charmander, how are you feeling now? Ash asked in a low, comforting tone as he bent down. The Charmander's head rose and it grunted to say it was okay. In the few minutes that Charmander was being treated, Ash had deeply thought about asking Charmander to join him. He would love to have a Pokémon he so desperately desired and yearned for not more than a few days back. But even more than that, Ash wanted the Charmander to be happy. If it decided that would be with him, great. If not, then Ash wouldn't be upset. Maybe leaving the Charmander with Nurse Joy would be a better idea. She could try to find a shelter for it, or better yet, keep it with her if she wanted. The different scenarios ceased playing in Ash's head as he petted the fire type gently. Charmander, if you want, you can come with me on my journey. He fervently awaited Charmander's response. To Ash's joy, Charmander's face perked up and it held excitedly, jumping on the desk as a smile played on its face. Really? Ash asked. His chest felt light at the prospect of having a Charmander. It nodded furiously as its tail swung, making Nurse Joy retreat from the desk, the flame-tipped tail wagging closer to her, though she grinned, and it leapt into Ash's arms. Charmander's excitement died down a few moments later and Ash placed it on the counter again. He drew an empty Pokeball from his pocket and gulped. He was about to catch his first Pokémon. Not in a way he'd imagined it. He'd thought he'd have a long, close fight alongside his starter and after a tense battle, he'd have his first capture. But he didn't mind this. He never imagined that his first two Pokémon would be Dratini and Charmander. Well, he'd thought it would be one of those, then another, but not both. He tapped Charmander softly with the Pokeball and it was sucked inside in a brilliant flash of crimson light. Ash watched with bated breath as the Pokeball rattled a few times before it finally settled and ceased movement. He blinked, then felt his eyes twinkle with flare and his heart thumped so hard that it might have left marks on his ribs. Then, it sunk in that this was reality. His lips curled from ear to ear. The Pokémon that his fortunes had denied him of was now his. His dream of getting a Charizard could be now fulfilled. Lucky way to catch a Pokémon, isn't it? He gasped out. Nurse Joy shook her head. That wasn't all luck, she grinned. I can certainly say that much. The sign pointing towards Viridian Forest stood in front of Ash. This was going to be quite an adventure. He'd just walked past the final checkpoint between Viridian City and the forest, which was also a place for trainers going to and fro to rest. He stood ever so close to entering the woods that he'd heard so much about. Finally, Ash began the trek. He'd barely walked for a quarter of an hour before the woods became so numerous and gigantic that it blocked almost all of the sun's rays from stealing a peek into the forest. The trees around him varied in size. He couldn't see the tip of the tallest, yet the shortest seemed to be just as high if he looked. He swore they didn't seem nearly as tall when he'd been on the outskirts. He felt tiny beneath them, insignificant, as if his existence didn't matter. The feeling only grew when he ambled a few more steps in the forest that led so many adrift. The ground concealed itself by lush green grass or moss or leaves or petals or wildflowers. A creaking of a dry leaf under his foot seemed like the only sound he'd heard after an eternity of silence. But after that, it felt as if his hearing had transcended human levels and crept into the perceptive realm of bats under the shelter of a murky cave. Buzzes and squeaks of Pokémon he couldn't distinguish penetrated his eardrums, and he felt lost amidst the barrage of noises that had his head swirl, then strain, then ache. Rustles accompanied the squeaks as a few dense, emerald-green bushes spread around the giant trees when he walked further, swishing and jiggling every so often to indicate the presence of hidden beings. Assurance that these were simply bug-type Pokémon and nothing else brought him calm for hardly a minute before another clattering of leaves or twigs would leave him in a cold sweat. This was Viridian Forest. The gossip paled in comparison to the reality of the place. Regardless, he continued walking down the endless dirt road until dusk slowly came and wrapped around the trees loosely. He sighed, exhaustion gradually creeping up on him. Ash laid on the cool, hard ground, his gaze captivated by the beautiful orange glow of the sinking sun, arms reposefully stretched wide, his fingers toying with the blades of grass every few seconds. There weren't many clearings, devoid of those thick trees that crowded Viridian Forest, and he wanted to enjoy what little time he'd get in the setting. His first day in Viridian Forest had been uncannily and unexpectedly uneventful, after the initial hours of excruciating unease. He wouldn't say he'd gotten used to the nature of it. He didn't think he would ever get used to it if he spent his entire life here. The odd battle with trainers, mostly bug-type specialists who seemed to have spent far longer in the forest than him, had allowed him to fight off the anxiety though. So he felt much better now, much more relaxed. He'd used the map in his Pokédex to progress through the woods, following it as closely as he could. He shivered at the thought of being lost. Dratini and Charmander, whom Ash had let out of their bowls a few minutes back, gazed at the lovely, relaxing scene beside him. They looked calm and content, especially Charmander. Ash had worried if the little lizard would come out of its shell after the cruelty it had endured. But his fears were unfounded. Contrarily, Charmander seemed to have had a calming effect on Dratini. The dragon hadn't misbehaved as much in its company, and they seemed to be getting along, in whatever little time they'd spent together. He'd let them watch each other's battles, so it could have been the reason. He was pleasantly surprised by the skill Charmander had shown. It was a fine battler, and its latent potential had Ash's heart tremble in excitement. Damien must have been an even bigger fool than Ash had initially thought to not have even scratched the surface of Charmander's potential. Dratini, Charmander, Ash said, his face turned to look at his Pokémon, who both looked back at him. His gaze returned to the sky again. Someday, when you're all grown up and can fly, I want you two to take me up there. He pointed to the darkened clouds above, but he thought he could see well beyond them. I want us to touch the clouds together. They remained quiet for a few moments, and Ash heard their perplexed cries, then watched their heads tilt. They glanced at the sky, puzzled. But their eyes gleamed with allure almost in unison, shining under the sunset as if they were a pair of green and violet orbs. Charmander and Dratini shared a quick glance, and determination replaced temptation in their eyes. Ash chuckled at the thought that they must have been trying to think of a way to grow wings. But they both could do it. Dratini and Charmander glared at Ash and hissed and barked, tails throbbing and fists clenched in case of Charmander. The two were determined to see this through, and Ash couldn't be happier to have them by his side. Maybe this was a good time to bring up the topic of names. "Hey Dratini," he called out, his eyes peering into the dragons. He couldn't deny that he felt the tiniest bit nervous about this. But he had Dratini's attention. "I've thought of a name for you," Dratini whirred, feverishly slithering a few feet closer to Ash. He hissed again, sparkling blue eyes gaping into Ash's. Ash chuckled at the excited response by Dratini. This was going better than he'd hoped. Much better. "Kaiser." Dratini's face tilted, his gaze still fixed on his trainer. His long, blue tail quivered, rasping the lush blades of grass. Ash's features lit up at the coo that Kaiser uttered. He yanked his face away when he saw Ash grinning at him. Ah, the little devil was embarrassed. He appeared to like the name though. "From now on, you're Kaiser," Ash cheered. "It means emperor, and I think it suits you perfectly." Once he'd fed those words to his brain, Kaiser sheepishly glided away. He appeared to enjoy the grandeur of the name. Ash shook his head at the antics of his starter and then turned his attention to his second Pokémon. Charmander happily swung its tail around and shrieked at him, a few tiny embers wisping in the air before fading. Ash's bright smile turned into a rampant grin. He didn't even have to ask if Charmander wanted a name. He could tell by his friend's reaction that it craved for one. He'd had a quick scan for Charmander with his Pokédex while he was in the Pokémon Center, and it had told him that the fire type was male. That was perfect, since Ash had thought of names for his Charmander, the one that he'd expected to get from Professor Oak, believing it would be a boy. Not that he had any way of knowing that. He'd mulled over it for days before he began his journey, and he'd eventually settled on one. "Would you like to be called Ignis?" Ash asked, his gaze meeting Charmander's, who instantly bobbed his head up and down. It probably didn't even matter to Charmander what name it was. He seemed exuberant just to have one. His tail still wagged around as he growled in delight and leapt into Ash's arms. The sudden hug had taken Ash by surprise, but he let his newest Pokémon lick him to his heart's content. "You like the name, don't you?" Ash managed between laughs as Ignis continued to tickle his face raptly. Later, Ash had let his Pokémon spend the night outside. It served the purpose of them protecting him from threats that the wild dwellers of the forest would obviously pose to him, and it would also let them get to know each other better. The special Pokémon food that he'd bought in Viridian City for dragon and fire types came in handy, as the two seemed to have enjoyed it more than normal. And they continued to savor the food, gulping it down bite by bite as their breakfast. Ash had finished his own far too quickly in comparison, but he found something worth doing in the meantime. He drew his Pokédex from his bag and scanned Ignis. Charmander, the lizard Pokémon. When the tip of Charmander's tail burns brightly, that indicates it's in good health. It said in its mechanical voice, which caught Ignis as well as Kaiser's attention as they ate. "This Charmander is male, its ability is Blaze. Its moves are Ember, Scratch, Growl and Metal Claw." Ash mused as he pressed a button on the Pokédex, then another, and read the moves that Ignis could learn. Dragon Rage. Ash read the text accompanying the name, considering it as a potential move worth learning. The move would add a counter for Ignis against water types, since his other moves wouldn't have much effect on them. Kaiser could also easily learn the move, although it would be more of a variant of his dragon power, which he already used in the form of Dragon Breath. Dragon Rage it was, a move worth investing in. A few more hours passed, a few more battles, and some wild Caterpie and Weedle on the way. the bug types escaping at his first sight. Not that Ash had tried to catch them. Kaiser and Ignis had stayed outside after their last battle and walked with him, chatting to one another. What Ash would give to understand their talk and share in their titters. Just then, Ash heard a few chirps from up above. He glanced towards the sky and caught a glimpse of a small, plump avian who sailed through the trees, meticulously piloting through the gaps in between. The cries surrounding it belonged to two Spearow who chased the Pidgey in rage, their wings flopping errantly amidst their ragged movements. The chase continued and Ash sprinted to follow the action. Pidgey turned its tiny head back, chirped and then pulled its wings wide while spinning back. It flew with grace, speed and power as its silver-tainted wings crashed into the hounding Spearow one after another. The two refused to back away and dashed at Pidgey, but it fought them off, first with another wing attack, then speeding through them in a show of impressive speed that left the Spearow gawking their heads in search of their prey. Pidgey slammed one Spearow with another wing attack, but the second's eyes glinted as its beak gashed into Pidgey's feathery gut. They cawed, almost akin to a victorious and mocking laugh, then swept through the air in pursuit of the descending Pidgey who had little control over its body. That all changed a moment later though, as a rainbow sheen, pretty as the phenomenon itself, engulfed Pidgey. Its body grew in proportions, starting from its wings that spread into a curl and its tail gained feathers. Its head and body changed shape, a beautiful mane emerging from its tufts. The newly evolved Pidgeotto chirped resoundingly and its glare honed in on its pursuers. Showing speed greater than its previous exploits, Pidgeotto gushed towards the Spearow whose earlier haughtiness had vanished just as they probably hoped they would. Before they could make their escape, Pidgeotto blindingly closed the distance with quick attack and slashed one wing on each of the Spearow. The two wild birds knew better than to stay and fled into the darkness of the trees much faster than they'd arrived. The calm nature of a Pidgeotto stopped the avian from giving chase as it floated in the air with nothing but a chirp. "Wow, that was great," Ash exclaimed, amazed by the display of speed by the flying type. Equally enthralling was the evolution he'd just witnessed. "Kaiser, let's catch that Pidgeotto, shock wave." Kaiser never shied away from a battle. He charged electricity in mere moments and launched it at Pidgeotto who'd just noticed them. It shrieked in agony as the super-effective move jolted its feathers, sparkling its wings. The attack had its feathers scrambled and surging and shook its being. It recovered faster than Ash had anticipated, and it descended once its eyes fixed on Kaiser, disappearing from Ash's vision for a moment, only a few visible trails to follow, then appearing right on top of Kaiser as it slammed itself on the dragon. "Its quick attack is so much faster now," Ash noted. Kaiser grimaced from the impact of the move, but that would hardly be enough to keep him down. Ash wanted this bird even more now. Aqua Jet, Kaiser's speed was on full display as he summoned water around himself and then flung himself at Pidgeotto, who'd hung low to the ground. It tried to fight him off with a gash of its wings, but Kaiser had already jutted back to the ground by then. He snarled triumphantly at the bird and it didn't shy away from returning a defiant cry. "Now Dragon Breath," Ash commanded. A stream of draconic energy poured at Pidgeotto, but it glided through the air with impressive maneuverability, wings outstretched and body floating as if it weighed nothing. It charged at Kaiser with a combination of quick attack, then wing attack and lashed its powered wings into the dragon. Ash grinned. It was rare to see wild Pokémon show such brilliant mastery of their moveset. Kaiser shrieked but stood strong even as Pidgeotto soared back into the air. He launched another Dragon Breath and Pidgeotto retreated further up into the clear skies that were so rare in the forest. Ash feared the Pidgeotto might try to run, although it didn't seem like it wanted to, and he'd have no way to chase it if it did. He needed to lure it closer to the surface. "Kaiser, use Leer. Try to provoke it to come at you," Ash said after a long, thoughtful moment. Kaiser shot a puzzled glance at Ash, but didn't disobey. He snarled, his eyes glinting as he took a measure of his foe, mockingly challenging it to try and make a move. It worked. Pidgeotto took the bait and dashed at Kaiser, descending sharply with its glorious wings outstretched, currents of air sizzling in its trail. "Now use Wrap, then Shock Wave," Ash roared. Just as the provoked Pidgeotto shoved him back with its wings, Kaiser held steady and coiled its flexible, long body around it. Ravaged cries of a desperate bird swept across the area, shaking the air in its wake as Pidgeotto flailed its body helplessly in the constraints of Kaiser. If it were visible, Ash was sure he'd have seen Kaiser smirk. The Dratini let sparks loose and Pidgeotto cried agonizingly. Ash grimaced at the pain that the bird went through, but Kaiser's vice-like grip remained until he was sure he'd won. Ash readied a Pokeball, and as soon as Pidgeotto was set free, bruised, beaten and burned, he lunged the Pokeball at it. His eyes twitched and sweat pooled down his forehead as its body vanished into the ball and it shook. Ash's heart hammered in his chest. The Pokeball wiggled back and forth, until, finally, it stopped. Ash walked towards his second capture and his grin couldn't have spread any further if he'd tried as he picked up Pidgeotto's Pokeball. Ignis and Kaiser joined him, the former merrily jumping around as he gazed eagerly at the Pokeball in Ash's hand. "We now have another friend," Ash grinned as he glanced at Ignis, then at Kaiser. "Good job, Kaiser." Ignis leapt again, then stepped towards Kaiser and praised him some more. Ash's starter flushed at the cheers from his friend. The two continued to communicate with shrieks, then squealed in delight. Ash wasn't sure why, but he was happy nonetheless. A quick look at his watch told Ash that it would be a good time to take a break. The group walked a little more and soon found the shades of a large, dense tree, one that didn't creep the soul out of Ash, to dwell under for a while. Ash let his first two Pokémon eat their lunch but decided to have his own meal later. He rummaged his backpack and withdrew a potion, then let Pidgeotto's Pokeball open. The avian manifested, and Ash couldn't resist a wince at the wounds on its body. The last shock wave from point-blank range had taken its toll. This might sting a bit. He quickly yet carefully sprayed the potion on the more obvious and harsh wounds first, then moved on to the lighter ones. The Pokémon cried as the spray plunged into its feather and then inside the flesh, and even Ignis and Kaiser had abandoned their food and came to it when they'd heard its cries. "You'll be good to go in a while," Ash smiled tenderly and stroked the soft, feathery head of his Pidgeotto. The newly captured Pokémon gazed at its trainer, then spared a glance for Ignis and Kaiser, who both looked at it with rampant curiosity. Ignis was the first to cry out a few words, then Kaiser shrieked a few times himself. It wasn't difficult to see that Ignis had affected Kaiser positively, even making it more friendly. Their friendship had blossomed swiftly. Pidgeotto's face brightened after a minute or two, the effects of the potion visible on her body as the few drops of blood that dripped earlier ceased. A few minutes later, Ash poured some Pokémon food in a bowl and placed it in front of Pidgeotto. "Eat it, Pidgeotto, it'll make you feel better." At first, Pidgeotto seemed hesitant but brought itself to steadily clam a piece of its meal. That was all it took for it to decide the food was to its liking and eat it vigorously. It must have been a different taste for the bird, much more packed in nutrients than the vegetation found in the wilderness. While it ate, Ash pointed his Pokédex at it. "Pidgeotto, the bird Pokémon and the evolved form of Pidgey. It is armed with sharp claws and dives from the sky to capture its prey. Unlike the more gentle Pidgey, Pidgeotto can be dangerous. It can carry its prey to its nest over 60 miles away. This Pidgeotto is female. Its ability is Keen Eye. Its moves are Gust, Sand Attack, Quick Attack, Whirlwind and Wing Attack." "That's a pretty good moveset," Ash complimented and petted his newest Pokémon once again. Pidgeotto chirped a gentle cry as she mouthed more of the food. He caressed her soft as wool feathers. The next 2 days went by without any unwanted incident. Ash progressed further and further into the forest, following the track in the forest with an eye on his position on the map in his Pokédex. His Pokémon had kept him company for most of that time, sparring a few times against trainers on their way. The trees had thinned evenly where he walked and he had more than a bit of sunshine to bathe in. Suddenly, a few rustles altered him. His senses sharpened as the sound got louder and closer. Footsteps, he concluded. From the corner of his eye, he saw a figure to his left. And behind it was another figure which filled Ash's curiosity. His eyes widened when he caught sight of the chaser. The first shadow ran by him in almost a blur while the second one slowed down, but it didn't relent in its chase. Ash scampered through the woods, ignoring the buzzes of the bugs that resulted, and a minute or two later, he caught up to them. "Wait, Leaf," he called out. The one giving chase, a girl his age, caramel-haired and sporting a round hat, shorter than a floppy yet bigger than a fedora, stopped in her tracks and promptly spun around. "Ash," she smiled brightly after a brief moment of surprise, her shoulders hunching as she eventually leaned on her knees. Ash jogged a few more steps and caught up to her. He shook his head as he watched her chest rise and fall, heavy, sagged breaths that graced his ears. He beamed at her. "You're already in Viridian Forest, huh?" Ash felt the growing need to pant, as his hands soon fell on his knees. That was quite a chase. Leaf let her body lazily collapse on the ground, uncaring about the dirt and soil beneath. "You think I'm some kind of a slowpoke in the form of a girl?" She held out her tongue playfully and Ash couldn't help but chuckle at her humor, dry as it was. One of his oldest and closest friends, Leaf was one of the trainers who was supposed to start her journey on the same day he had. Of course, Ash hadn't waited until the other trainers arrived, and his lack of patience was to thank for that. Not that it would have mattered. To be honest though, if there was one friend that he'd have wanted to meet before he left, it would be Leaf. "No," Ash replied to her after the longest time. He let himself fall on the ground beside her, still taking a few shallow breaths. "I'm just surprised you made it as far as I did." "So you did think that?" Leaf snorted, pouting then looking the other way in exasperation. Ash was sure she'd forced that. "You didn't even wait for us that day." Her voice lost its vigor over those words. "Not even me." There was no defense against that. He really shouldn't have left like that, but he couldn't help it. "Yeah, that was stupid of me," he said softly. "I'm sorry about that. By the way," Leaf finally turned to face him again, her face lighting up about whatever she'd just remembered. "Professor Oak said that you started with a really amazing Pokémon that isn't one of the starters." Her eyes twinkled with nothing but curiosity. "What's that Pokémon?" "Yeah, I sure did." Ash grinned. "My starter is a Dratini," he boasted, swelling with pride. Leaf's eyes bulged. "That's amazing," she gasped. Ash shot her a half smile as she took a few moments to calm her breathing. "Anyway, I sure am glad to meet you here. You're like my hero now, you know." Ash's eyebrow curved. "Hero? Why is that? I didn't do anything to save you." Leaf laid herself flat on the ground, her hands pillowing her flowing brown hair as her hat tumbled a couple feet away. "You totally did," she pointed out. Ash's eyes followed her hat rolling on the ground, a short burst of wind threatening to blow it away with the fallen leaves, but he snatched it before it could. Leaf didn't seem to care as she lost her gaze in the sky. "I thought I would be lost here forever. But I am so lucky to have met you." He joined her on the ground, handing the hat to her which she grabbed absent-mindedly. "What were you after? Which Pokémon was it?" Ash asked. Its speed was great for a Pokémon that seemed only slightly shorter than Ash himself, from what he could derive from its shadow, at least. It was a Scyther, she confirmed. Ash's eyebrows almost touched his temples at the mention of Scyther. They weren't the most common Pokémon going around. I guess you could say this was my lucky day. I came across a Scyther, and as I was trying to catch it, I found you. She giggled happily as she too laid her entire body on the ground. I hope I could just teleport out to Pewter City though, her face squished. Ash would have been surprised had she liked Viridian Forest. He was already tired of it, and Leaf had probably been scared to death by the bugs. She was fairly comfortable with most bug-type Pokémon, but Viridian Forest had a way to drive people out of their comfort zones. I wouldn't mind that. Ash smiled, then frowned. You haven't tried to take any shortcuts, have you? I should have met you much earlier if you've been following the main trail. I have, Leaf admitted, grinning as if proud of herself. I did find a shortcut, didn't I? She pumped her fist in the air and let out a series of giggles. You're an idiot, you know that. Ash's tone had a hint of sarcasm, but it wasn't devoid of truth. She could have easily found herself strayed in the wilderness, lost amidst the bugs and trees that weren't the most welcoming. He groaned as he sat back up. This girl never ceased to be adventurous. There's some time before sunset. We can still make some progress. Leaf rose up instantly in alarm. I am coming with you. Ash peered at her doubtfully. You'll slow me down, so no thanks, he denied. A frolicking smirk hinged on the corners of his mouth, but he held it down. As he began to walk, Leaf grasped his wrist from behind, hauling him towards herself with all her force as she used him as support to rise. Do you really think I'll let you go? She pouted, then skipped in front of Ash. What if I die here? She tittered again, clutching his palm with both her hands. She knew him too well to not know Ash was joking. All right, Ash groaned, scratching his ear. But if you slow me down, I'll just leave you here. This meeting refreshed Ash's spirits. Not that he was down, but he always enjoyed his time with Leaf. Not everyone was here, and it would have been a lot more fun if Gary was present. Or maybe not. He rolled his eyes as images of Gary flashed in his mind, particularly those of him acting cocky. And if I die in this forest because of that, I'll haunt you forever, Leaf giggled before she danced the next few steps. Oh boy, this could be fun but tiring.
If you like this video, please do one thing, like it, share it with your those friends who love to watch Pokemon or any fanfic of anime which are related to specific genres. So please do that and turn on the bell icon for notification of these any other series which are still ongoing on channel. Thanks for watching.